Is the attitude in other countries changing as well? Or?
Well, when you look at France or at Spain, people are in favor of the Eurozone. Now you can say, okay, they promise themselves to have benefits in the current situation. Yes, of course. I think the utmost critical countries where the general population is critical is Finland, it's Austria, and it's Germany. Apart from that, I think there's a lot of consensus pro-Europe. And also, if we had a referendum in Greece, I'm very sure that it would be positive with an outcome of 60 to 70% improvement for a simple reason. If Greece turns against the reform agenda, anybody who's got a job, and there's 85% of the workforce, basically signs themselves into unemployment. So but we won't get the referendum anyway. In that respect, this discussion is rather theoretical.
It's speculative. How do you see things unfolding then over the next several months?
Well, I think the approach in July, with the EFSF being enlarged and possibly given leverage to it, together with the support lines now by the IMF, with liquidity lines to countries that run into problems, together with the pressure of G20, in particular out of the Asian region, will morph into a situation where the progress in the Eurozone will come more into the forefront. I'm very, very positive that the Eurozone will gather momentum and will have a different standing in 2012 than in 2011. But there are still a lot of risks prevalent, but I remain positive on this count. And also I want to point out, I mentioned that earlier, if you look at the global cycles in the economy, we've seen a reduction of the global dynamics due to political risks. The very moment these political risks recede, we will see a pop-up of the global economy. Currently, my colleagues are calling down global growth forecasts for 2012 and also central banks, etc. And I feel very relieved. They got it wrong since 2007, so they're going to get it wrong here again. What we are saying next year is, for instance, I'm coming from Hamburg, I'm very Hanseatic, so I like understatement. I'm saying the IMF call for global growth of 4% is in line with my forecast, but qualified as a Hanseatic approach. If my theory is right, we will see next year that risks are receding, that the progress in the Eurozone is being discounted, the political risk is diminished. If that is going to happen, we will see global growth next year standing at 5%, high inflationary pressures. And talking about the German economy, the 5 wise men called for a growth next year of 0.8%. In the muddled through scenario, which is the Hanseatic one for the Eurozone, I call for 1.7, and if things go like I favor, I see 3% growth in Germany next year.
Yeah, but with a higher inflation rate.
High inflation rate.
But is that a cost that you're willing to absorb in order to enable the Eurozone to continue operating?
Yes. And I think we lived very well back in the 80s with a comparatively high level of inflation. And one way of overcoming the high indebtedness of the public sector is, in my eyes, that people, in particular in the US and UK, want a certain degree of inflation in order to inflate away the debt. Now that is, of course, not a fair deal to those who run their finances in a conservative fashion. And I'm not saying it's good, but I'm going to say it's going to happen.
Yeah, on both sides of the Atlantic.
Both sides of the Atlantic, but then again, if you look to Switzerland, if you look to continental Europe, it will be less dynamic than in the US and the UK.
So the US dollar will fall relative to the euro?
I see the US coming under pressure, and I think that is a genuine trend which started back, we can go back to 1971, closing the gold window, and it's a long-lasting trend, and it corresponds also with the share of which they have in the global economy. Go back 30 years, America's share of the global economy was standing somewhere close to 30%. They are now at 17%, and they have creative accounting. Also, the GDP is creative accounting. I mean, the gross numbers being produced over there and productivity numbers, they are very suspicious. I'm again here with John Williams, and I wrote a book, Finally Outspoken, the translation, and I was also looking at US statistics. I mean, they are a little bit, the quality is comparable to the statistics of Moscow back in 1985. Marketing, enchanting, but not necessarily corresponding to the real economy.
Yeah. How do you see the U.S. unfolding? I'm very skeptical that they're going to get back on the right road, and that the dollar is going to continue to be in trouble. I mean, the last month the U.S. government borrowed $200 billion in 1 month. These are unsustainable.
It is unsustainable. America needs a shift. Let's talk about the setup of an economy. Now, the productive sector, producing goods, is on average in industrialized nations at 14% of GDP. So 14% of GDP is producing goods. That's the average. Germany stands at 22%, which is high. Ireland at 25%, very strong economy, with growth of 13.7% back in 2010 in that sector. Now America stands at 9%. And again, the creative accounting is very visible because producing hamburgers and cheeseburgers is part of industrial production. America needs to address this topic, get production back into the country. That's high-paid jobs, that is capital stock of the economy. Unless they start to look into these fields and start changing the roads they took back in the early 90s, America will lose status. That's one thing. And the other thing, let's talk about Republicans and Democrats. Under Clinton, we had a situation where, with the public debt in 2000, which only increased by 18 billion US dollars. At that time, the share of income tax stood at 10.4% of GDP. Now it stands at 6%, which is a low basically since 1947. And we have very high public debt. And now Republicans and Tea Party participants call for lower taxes in order to overcome the debt problems. Now this is ridiculous. America needs to raise taxes for those who can afford. That's a deal of the society. America needs to overcome the environment of running an elite and impoverishing the rest of the nation. And these fields need to be addressed. If they are not addressed, America will fail.
Do you see raising taxes more important than cutting spending?
I think both are important, but raising taxes is something where I can have an immediate impact, and where the social freedom is being improved. And we have the Occupy Wall Street movement now, so the split, in order to heal the split, that is simply necessary in my eyes. And we need to cut spending. And one field is very easy to cut, which is the military sector. But that does not go very well with the Republicans, I presume. Yeah.
I just did an analysis and an article on this recently. U.S. government spending at all levels of government is just over 41% of the total GDP. And it's never been this high ever, even during the Second World War, which to me suggests that government has become too big, and that the private sector, which is really where wealth is created, has to grow. So I would like to see a dramatic cut in government spending and enable the private sector to do what it does best, which is create wealth, because after all, the wealth the government spends comes from the private sector.
That's also in school, but again, the point is, how do you generate that? If you do it from now, if you do it immediately, you run a higher risk of derailing the whole economy. What you need to do is, and again here I'm calling for the evolutionary path, is just to change the direction of your policies and take steps that are not too harsh to derail the economy. Because in order to get fiscal healing, you need a performing economy. Let's talk about Greece, for instance. We've seen a contraction of the GDP throughout the last 2 years by 10%. And they managed to get down new debt from 15.4 of GDP down to 8.5. Proves, by the way, the success of structural reforms being implemented throughout the last 2 years. People don't look at that currently. They are very one-sided. But we need, in order to have a real fiscal healing, a further positive performance of the economy. That is very, very helpful. And that makes the, let's say, cuts for the general population more tolerable. We won't get the referendum anyway. In that respect, this is this discussion is rather theoretical.
It's speculative. How do you see things unfolding then over the next several months?
Well, I think the approach in July, with the EFSF being enlarged and possibly given leverage to it, together
Is the attitude in other countries changing as well? Or?
Well, when you look at France or at Spain, people are in favor of the Eurozone. Now you can say, okay, they promise themselves to have benefits in the current situation. Yes, of course. I think the utmost critical countries where the general population is critical is Finland, it's Austria, and it's Germany. Apart from that, I think there's a lot of consensus pro-Europe. And also, if we had a referendum in Greece, I'm very sure that it would be positive with an outcome of 60 to 70% improvement for a simple reason. If Greece turns against the reform agenda, anybody who's got a job, and that's 85% of the workforce, basically signs themselves into unemployment. So but with the support lines now by the IMF, with liquidity lines to countries that run into problems, together with the pressure of G20 in particular out of the Asian region, will morph into a situation where the progress in the Eurozone will come more into the forefront. I'm very, very positive that the Eurozone